Okay, let's lock in and talk about the neuromuscular system. At the end of this video, you see just how complex, exciting, and fascinating the neuromuscular system is. So, what is the neuromuscular system? When we talk about the neuromuscular system, we have the neuro part of this, which is just referring to the nervous system. So, your brain, your spinal cord, and your nerves. And we have the muscular system, which is referring in this context to your skeletal muscles. And this is important to create movement, to control movement, to produce force, coordinate skills, adapt to fatigue, and to react quickly in sports. This is the command chain in the neuromuscular system. So this is how it starts, and this is how it goes all the way down to the muscles. So it all starts in the brain, and the brain and the spinal cord make up something we call, this is the brain and the spinal cord here, make up something we call the central nervous system. Central nervous system, or CNS for short. And the central nervous system is where it all starts. So in the brain, what happens is you decide to move. Let's say you're lifting a weight during a bicep curl. You decide to pick up that weight and lift the weight. That's the decision, and that's where everything starts. Then that information moves down the spinal cord, which is like a data highway that is sending messages down, and also some information gets brought up. But in this case, you're sending information down the spinal cord. That information is in the form of electrical impulses. So those impulses carry an electrical message that moves down into the motor neuron. We're going to look more into detail about what a motor neuron actually is. So the motor neuron takes that electrical impulse and it sends that impulse into the muscle. So you see these are individual muscle fibers here that are connected to this motor neuron. So this is the motor neuron here. Motor neuron. So that electrical message gets sent into the muscle, and then now we have the muscle cells, the individual muscle cells. So you have tiny cells inside your muscle called muscle fibers or myofibers. So that signal reaches the muscle fibers at a special connection point, which we call the neuromuscular junction. We're going to look more into detail about what a neuromuscular junction is and what it looks like. So the neuromuscular junction is just the junction between the end of the motor neuron and the motor and the muscle fiber that it connects to. So if you see this motor neuron ends around here, and then after that it's just the muscle fiber. So it ends around here, ends around here. That point where, let's say this is the motor neuron and this is the end of the motor neuron, that point where the motor neuron ends and the muscle fiber begins, let's say this is a muscle fiber, this sort of bridge area here, that's what we call the neuromuscular junction. Neuromuscular junction. The neuromuscular junction is also known as the motor end plate, also referred to as the neuromuscular end plate. So it has a bunch of names, but the main one is neuromuscular junction. And why is this chain of command really important? Well, we're going to look more into detail in this video, but this chain of command is basically important during performance because it helps to recruit the correct muscles at the correct time. It helps to recruit enough of these muscle fibers to create the force that you need, and it helps to keep coordination under pressure and even when you're fatigued. That's why if you watch an elite performer, when they perform, everything looks really smooth. This is because this chain of command is really developed. So their nervous system is sending a lot cleaner, a lot faster, a lot better signals to their muscle. So there are three fiber types you need to know. We're going to look at them. We're going to look at their functions and their characteristics that allow them to carry out those functions. So type 1 muscle fiber is a slow twitch, slow oxidative muscle fiber. Type 1 muscle fibers contract slowly. They produce lower amounts of force. They're very fatigue resistant, which means they can work for a long time without being tired. They use aerobic energy production, and examples of type 1 muscle fiber activities or activities that predominantly rely on type 1 muscle fibers are things like marathon, anything that's long distance cycling, any long distance running, and so on and so forth. And here are some structural characteristics of type 1 muscle fibers that allow them to be able to do these functions. So type 1 muscle fibers have more mitochondria, and having more mitochondria enables more aerobic energy production. Type 1 muscle fibers have more myoglobin, which stores and carries oxygen inside the muscles. Type 1 muscle fibers have greater capillarization or greater capillary density, which increases blood supply, which means there's more oxygen delivery and there's better waste removal. And lastly, type 1 muscle fibers usually have a small diameter, which is why they produce less force, but they're very efficient for endurance. Now let's move on to the next type of muscle fiber, which is called type 2A muscle fiber, fast oxidative glycolytic. And this type 2A muscle fiber contracts fast, produces moderate to high amounts of force. They're moderately fatigue resistant, and they can use both aerobic and anaerobic energy systems. Examples are 400-meter race, going several boxing rounds. So this is like in the middle of aerobic and anaerobic, because these examples are still very intense, but they're not as intense as, say, a 100-meter sprint, and they're not as endurance based as a marathon. Now, if we look at the structure of type 2A muscle fibers, they're usually in the middle of type 1 and the other type that we will look at in a minute, which is called type 2X. And that's because they have moderate levels of mitochondria, moderate capillarization, they do have a large size, and they have moderate anaerobic capacity. Now, we're going to look at type 2X fast glycolytic muscle fibers. These are the ones that contract very fast, produce very high amounts of force. They fatigue quickly though, and they mainly rely on anaerobic energy production, especially a process called glycolysis. Examples of activities that would predominantly use type 2X muscle fibers are 100-meter sprint, a shot put, javelin throw, things like that. So these are exercises that have very low duration and require a high power output. And the structural characteristics of type 2X muscle fibers that allow them to carry out their function: they have a large diameter, so they're very large in size. They have more stored glycogen and glycolytic enzymes, which allows for faster breakdown of fuel without oxygen. They have fewer mitochondria and less myoglobin, which is why their aerobic capacity, their aerobic endurance is weaker. And again, remember that type 2A muscle fibers kind of sit in the middle of type 1 and type 2X, in a sense that they're not as explosive as type 2X, but they're not as endurance based as type 1. All right, now let's talk about recruitment. Let's talk about recruitment patterns for endurance based activities compared to power based activities. So, what is recruitment in the first place? Recruitment means how the nervous system turns on or activates muscle fibers to create force. And to understand the concept of recruitment, we need to look at a motor unit in more detail. So, what's a motor unit? A motor unit is made up of one motor neuron and so one motor neuron plus all the muscle fibers that it controls. So this is a simple diagram of what a motor unit would look like. So we have the motor neuron, the neuron here, and that neuron connects to these individual muscle fibers. So this is one fiber, the second fiber, the third fiber, fourth fibers. These are all individual muscle fibers, but they are all connected to this motor neuron. And we have different sizes of motor neurons, right? Because sometimes you need to create a large amount of force. Other times you just need to use your fingers to write, which doesn't require massive motor units. So you have different sizes of motor neurons and motor units. Small motor units control fine movement, like in the fingers, and large motor units control powerful movement, like in your legs when you're sprinting. And when the nervous system turns on, remember we had this definition of recruitment here. When the nervous system turns on the muscle fibers, which are part of the motor unit, they obviously have to activate the motor unit. And they do this through a principle called the size principle. So the size principle states that the nervous system typically recruits motor units in an orderly pattern. So starting with the smaller, low threshold motor units first, and then the larger ones as more force is needed. This links to something known as the Hahnemann's size principle. And what do we mean by threshold? Threshold just means the minimum level of excitement or stimulation that is needed to actually turn on those motor units and those muscle fibers. So a threshold is like a door, and a door that requires a certain amount of force to be pushed into it to be able to break open that door. A low threshold motor unit means that door doesn't require as much force. You can just push it open with your pinky finger, and so it's easy to recruit those motor units and to turn them on. Meanwhile, a higher threshold motor unit would need a lot more force to knock down that door. So to round this all up and see the differences between endurance-based activities and power-based activities, these are how recruitment patterns differ between these two different types of activities. So obviously endurance-based activities have higher duration, lower force, power-based, lower duration, higher force. And in endurance-based activities, there is a use of a lot of type 1 muscle fibers. There's also a steady recruitment of motor units at lower thresholds. And as fatigue builds up, the body gradually adds some more type 2A muscle fibers to maintain output. So as fatigue is building up, the type 1 muscle fibers are eventually going to start being less effective. That's when type 2A muscle fibers might get thrown into the mix. Now for power based activities, this is the recruitment pattern for how that goes. So power events usually require rapid recruitment of high threshold motor units. And during power activities, there's usually more type 2A and type 2X activation. And we also have higher firing rates. We're going to explain this concept of firing rates as well in more detail in this video. So this is why training is so important, right? Because you can actually control this recruitment using training. So think of three main things when we talk about training and controlling recruitment. Training leads to better recruitment of those high threshold motor units because strength and power training specifically improves your ability to access the type 2A or type 2X muscle fibers during explosive activity. Next, we have better rate coding or higher firing frequency. So stronger athletes usually drive higher motor neuron firing rates. So they produce a much stronger electrical impulse, which gets sent to those high threshold motor units, which obviously increases the amount of force they can output. And third, we have better coordination. both intermuscular and intramuscular coordination. So intermuscular coordination is within a muscle. So this is being able to recruit the right muscle fibers within the muscles at the right time. And intramuscular coordination is between the muscles. So this is different muscles working together, like the agonists working together with the synergists and the fixators, all of them working together. We looked at those different muscle roles, agonists, antagonists, synergists, fixators in the previous video. You can go check it out if you don't remember. So just remember, intermuscular is within the muscle, intramuscular is between the muscles. All right, now this is where it becomes very scientific. So we're going to zoom in a lot from here on out. Now, and we're going to talk about the anatomy of the neuromuscular system. We're going to look in more detail at the central nervous system, the muscle fibers, something we call myofibrils, something we call sarcomeres, motor units, neuromuscular junction, actin, myosin, troponin, tropomyosin. So let's break it down, right? So we have this nice diagram that zooms in to the organization of a muscle all the way from the muscle body. So this, let's say this is your biceps. This is the actual muscle body right there. And then we zoom in again and we get these bundles called fascicles. So these bundles are called fascicles. This is a fascicle right here. Inside a fascicle, we have muscle fibers. So these little structures here, these little round things you can see is muscle fibers. So we have muscle fiber, which is one muscle cell. And then inside the muscle fibers, we have these small structures called myofibrils. So this is a myofibril. And these are like small thread-like structures that are found inside the muscle fibers. And inside myofibrils, we have something smaller, which we can't see in this diagram, but we're going to zoom in on this video later on. Smaller units, and these structures are called sarcomere. We have sarcomeres inside the myofibril. The sarcomere is made up of a bunch of different things, but the main ones are actin and myosin. Actin and myosin. And these are very important proteins that are very necessary for muscle contractions. And we're going to look at why. Right, so the high level summary of why is that myosin grabs onto actin and then yanks actin. And we call that yanking, and that whole process of yanking, the sliding filament theory. But we're going to zoom into that later on in this video as well. All right, now let's break down how everything happens from the brain all the way to the sarcomere. And we're going to put this into writing later on. So this is your brain right here. You're holding a bicep curl. You want to lift a weight for a bicep curl. And you think to yourself, oh, let me lift this weight for a bicep curl. Boom, that creates an electrical impulse in your brain. That impulse moves down through the spinal cord, and then from there it branches into a motor neuron, which is part of a motor unit. And this is a motor neuron which I've zoomed out here just to look at the massive bulb at the end of it. So this is your motor neuron, this whole structure here. And the specific part of the motor neuron that we are looking at is the neuromuscular junction. Remember, we talked about the neuromuscular junction being this bridge here between, I'm just going to write NMJ, neuromuscular junction, this bridge here between where the motor neuron ends and the muscle fiber begins. So this gap right here is your neuromuscular junction. Okay, so that impulse, which we call an action potential, that's what the impulse is called. That action potential moves down the motor neuron and it gets to this end sort of bulb of the motor neuron, and that action potential triggers some channels to open up. So imagine these channels were closed before. These channels were closed before. And then boom, the action potential comes along. The action potential triggers these channels, and we call these channels voltage gated calcium channels. So voltage gated calcium channels. Right? So the action potential comes along, and then boom, these channels all of a sudden start opening up. They're like little gates. They start opening up. And why are they opening up? They're opening up because there's going to be a bunch of calcium ions that flood into the motor neuron. Calcium ions are going to flood in. So these calcium ions, which are charged particles, they move into this bulb at the end of the motor neuron. And why are they so important? Because they allow the release of a really, really important substance called acetylcholine. So you see these little dots here? These little dots are something we call acetylcholine or ACH. So how do they allow this? They basically think of these circles sort of opening up like this. Circles open up like this. And then they can flow out like this. So boom, they flow out into this space here. And then once they flow out, they bind onto some receptors that are on this muscle fiber edge. And this edge, we call this the motor end plate. So they bind on this, the edge of this muscle fiber here. And this kickstarts another process. And this allows that action potential, that electrical impulse, to continue moving into this muscle fiber. So that electrical impulse hits the muscle fiber, it spreads across the muscle fiber, and then it dives into this structure, this dip right here, this hole, which we call T tubules. So there are a bunch of these holes in the muscle fiber. This is just, we've just cut out the tiny section of the muscle fiber here. There's a bunch of these T tubules in the muscle fiber. So the signal dives deep into the T tubules. And it's important it enters here because it allows calcium to be released from these structures here. And what are these structures called? We call these structures the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Sarcoplasmic reticulum. Think of the sarcoplasmic reticulum as a calcium bank. So a money bank, you store your money. The calcium bank, which is the sarcoplasmic reticulum, is where you store your calcium to be released for muscle contraction. So boom, the signal comes from the motor neuron, spreads across the muscle fiber, enters the T tubule, enters the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release a bunch of calcium. And what happens next is the sliding filament theory. So here's how the sliding filament theory works. Okay, now the muscle still hasn't contracted yet. That signal has moved down from the motor neuron to the muscle fiber to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Calcium has been released. Calcium then comes to the sarcomere. Remember we talked about the sarcomere? This is where the sliding filament occurs. This is where the myosin binds with the actin and yanks it. Remember we talked about the yanking? So these purple structures here, that's the actin, and the blue structures, myosin. You see myosin has these little heads pointing out, and these heads are important to actually bind onto the actin and yank it. So let's zoom in even more to see what calcium really does. So just for reference, this is a sarcomere when the muscle is relaxed. You see this actin is still quite far apart. There's still a large space here because they haven't been yanked to shorten the muscle yet. But then when the sarcomere is contracted, so let's write contracted, contracted sarcomere. You see this myosin has been binded into the actin and has actually yanked it towards the middle. And so you can see this space is a lot smaller right here and the muscle has shortened, the muscle has contracted. But let's zoom in to see what's actually happening. So remember, we still have that calcium that has come from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that calcium interacts with something we call troponin and another thing we call tropomyosin. So this is troponin. Think of troponin like a lock, and this red sort of gate is tropomyosin. So think of tropomyosin as a gate and troponin is a lock on that gate. So you unlock the lock to actually unlock the gate. And calcium does that. So calcium comes as a calcium, it binds onto troponin, and then because it's bound onto troponin, it causes troponin to unlock and shift the tropomyosin gate. So this tropomyosin gets shifted. And now, would you look at that? There is no more tropomyosin blocking the entrance of the actin. There's no more gate. The gate has shifted, the gate has opened up, and these myosin heads are like, whoa, there's space for us to bind in the actin now. So they actually bind into the actin sites, bind in there, bind in there, bind in there, bind in there, and bind in there. Now the myosin has been bound to the actin, and we call this a cross bridge formation. Cross bridge formation. This is the structure where actin actually gets bound to myosin. So what happens next is that the myosin pulls on the actin. They pull on the actin towards this center area. So if we go back to this bigger diagram, this is the actin, and the actin gets pulled towards this center area. And that pulling is the yanking I was talking about. We can refer to that yanking as a power stroke. So that power stroke is what actually causes the contraction, the shortening of the muscle. So that power stroke is when myosin binds into actin and then it pulls actin towards the middle. And this just carries on over and over and over again as much times as you need to contract the muscle. So this whole process we've talked about is basically the physiology of a muscular contraction. So we've spoken about the nerve impulse, the muscle response, we've looked at the neuromuscular junction, sliding filament. We're still to look at wave summation and gradation. But just to put into writing what we have right now, we have these steps. So step 1, the nerve signal arrives at the neuromuscular junction like we spoke about. An action potential travels down the motor neuron to the nerve terminal, which is that bulb area. So that bulb area we drew that looks something like this. So the action potential, which is the electrical impulse, travels down the motor neuron to that bulb, the nerve terminal, and then it opens the voltage gated calcium channels for calcium ions to flood in. Calcium then triggers the vesicles, which are just those circles with the acetylcholine in it. Those circles are called vesicles. So calcium triggers the vesicles to release acetylcholine, very important, into the synaptic cleft. So the synaptic cleft is just that gap where the neuromuscular junction is. So what is a synaptic cleft? The synaptic cleft is this gap right here. So it's similar to the neuromuscular junction, but we call it the synaptic cleft. Then what happens next? Acetylcholine binds to the receptors on the muscle, and then it causes that signal, that electrical impulse to move across the muscle and this causes something called depolarization. Depolarization just means the signal becomes increasingly positively charged, so it causes those positive charges to move across the muscle. Then step two, that electrical impulse, the muscle action potential spreads, and this is called excitation. So excitation is when the electrical impulse spreads along the muscle fiber sarcolemma, and then it enters the muscle fiber via the T tubules we talked about. And then step three is when calcium is now released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that calcium helps to kickstart sliding filament and the cross bridge cycle, which is where contraction ultimately happens. So we can condense or translate this into five main stages. We have the resting phase, which is where that cross bridge formation, that sliding filament hasn't begun yet. So the actin site is still blocked by tropomyosin. There is low calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the muscles are relaxed. Next, we have excitation. Excitation is where that nerve signal actually arrives. It releases acetylcholine, and then there's the depolarization, where the muscle cell becomes increasingly positively charged. And then positive charges moves down the sarcoplasmic reticulum, causing calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then contraction is where calcium actually binds onto troponin, causing that tropomyosin gate to peel off. And then the myosin heads can actually bind into the actin, and the cross bridge formation, that cross bridge cycling happens. And this causes tension to increase, muscle to shorten, and the muscle can produce force. Next, we have recharge, which is where after the myosin is yanked, the actin a couple of times, obviously it needs to rest a little bit before going again. So the myosin detaches, and ATP helps the myosin to detach, and then it reattaches again to go back to the yanking. And throughout all of this, calcium is consistently needed as well. Next, we have relaxing. The relaxing phase is where stimulation stops, acetylcholine breaks down, the calcium returns back to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then the tropomyosin, that gate, closes back the actin again, and then tension falls. This is when you've stopped exercising, you've stopped contracting the muscles, and the muscles relax. All right, so this whole process of the muscle fiber being stimulated to contract always follows something we call the all or none law. So the all or none law states that a single muscle fiber either fully contracts when threshold is reached, or it doesn't contract at all. So you can't have a half contraction, right? You can't contract a single muscle fiber only 50% or only 75%. So what do we need to do in real life when we actually want to only use like 30% of our max strength or 50% of our max strength? Well, that's where something called summation comes in. When we talk about wave summation, we have two types. We have wave summation, which is also known as temporal summation. So wave or temporal summation. And we also have tetanus. So we're going to focus more on temporal summation because that's more common. What's temporal summation? Temporal summation is when a second nerve impulse arrives just before the muscle has fully relaxed. So we've talked about this nerve impulse traveling down the brain, going into the motor unit, stimulating the muscle fiber, causing it to contract. But you're going to need it to contract multiple times. Like if I'm running, I don't want my muscle to contract once and relax. I want it to contract multiple times, thousands of times, so it can keep contracting and keep moving me. So what happens is that just before one muscle fiber has fully relaxed, another impulse gets sent. So it contracts again, and then another one gets sent. So if we look at it on this graph, muscle fiber gets stimulated, it contracts, then just before it starts relaxing, boom, another impulse gets sent. It contracts. Just before it starts relaxing, boom, another impulse gets sent and contract. And this happens over and over and over again until the muscle actually relaxes. So that's wave summation. Tetanus is a bit more extreme. So if we look at this on a graph, tetanus is where multiple impulses get sent a lot more rapidly to basically create a lot more force output. So the muscle fiber gets stimulated, and even before it's even fully relaxed, another impulse gets sent, another impulse gets sent, another impulse gets sent, and multiple impulses get sent until it gets to max tension and it plateaus at max tension. And that happens until the muscle relaxes again. So we have something called gradation, and gradation is again how to control the amount of force that you're outputting, because sometimes you just want to use 30% of your strength, 50% of your strength. And the two gradation mechanisms we have is we have spatial summation. This is where you simply increase the amount of motor units that are being activated to be able to produce more force. Or if you want to produce less force, you would decrease the number of motor units that are being activated. So we have spatial summation or spatial recruitment, and we have temporal summation, which is what we're spoken about, increasing the firing frequency so that motor neurons and their contractions overlap with each other. So before that one motor neuron relaxes, you send another impulse. And then before it relaxes, you send another one, and another one, and another one. So you're increasing that firing frequency. And that's basically how you can go from a gentle jog to a maximal sprint, all without breaking the all or none law that we looked at. Okay, we're coming towards the end of this video. We're going to look at acute responses of the neuromuscular system to warming up and to immediate activity. We're going to look at the structural and the functional responses. So what happens during a warm-up? Once a warm-up begins, so this is immediately as you begin exercising, muscle temperature obviously increases, nerve conduction speed increases. This means those electrical signals travel faster. Enzyme activity increases. This means the reactions that happen in the muscle and in the body speed up to be able to release energy better. Elasticity increases in that muscle tendon unit, which reduces the risk of injury, and motor unit activation increases. So this is why after a warm-up, you start to feel a bit sharper, because your nervous system can recruit those muscle fibers faster and can also coordinate them better. All right, now you've been exercising for a little bit, maybe a few minutes or so, 20, 30 minutes or so. Exercise continues, and then you might experience reduced force output as you start to fatigue. You might also experience reduced coordination, slower reaction time as your brain starts to fatigue, and less efficient recruitment patterns as your body is trying to compensate for the fatigue. Lastly, let's look at chronic adaptations to training. Chronic adaptations, chronic just means long term. So if you've been training regularly for a long period of time, you're going to experience increased motor unit recruitment. So motor unit recruitment improving means you can access more muscle fibers, and this basically increases the amount of strength you can produce. Increased firing rates or rate coding, and improvement in coordination and movement efficiency. Also, chronic adaptations include some fiber type and metabolic adaptations too. For example, under the fiber type, let's say you do a lot of marathons, you might find that your type 2A muscles become a little bit more aerobic as opposed to anaerobic. And for metabolic, you might find that your enzymes that help to release energy in the muscles improve, and also the function of things like mitochondria and capillaries improve as well. Alright, so we've gone a lot into detail in this video, but just like with a lot of units in anatomy and physiology, I think it's just repetition, repetition, repetition. You do this enough times, it becomes second nature. That's why we have a bunch of resources at our website to help you with anything you need to ace your exam. So visit superpeonline.com for everything you need. See you in the next video.